Good day, everyone. My name is David Williams, Executive Director of the United States Association for Energy Economics. It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the Dennis J. O'Brien Virtual USAEE IAEE Best Student Paper Competition. We are grateful to our moderator and chair of the Best Paper Competition, Dr. Eric Hittinger from the Rochester Institute of Technology, and our students who will compete for the best paper, as well as our distinguished judges who will evaluate the presentations. We're also grateful to the International Association for Energy Economics, IAEE, for their long-standing support of this program. First, a little bit about the United States Association for Energy Economics. We are the largest affiliate of the International Association for Energy Economics and provide a forum for the exchange of ideas, experience, and issues among professionals interested in the field. The organization produces 2 professional journals, a newsletter, and holds conferences and virtual presentations, along with a host of other products and services that you can find on our website at www.usae.org. If you're not already a member of the association, we welcome you to join. A few housekeeping matters in regard to today's webinar before I hand things over to our moderator. First, this webinar is being recorded for those that cannot participate in today's live event. If you have questions for our students, please click the Q&A button at the bottom of your Zoom window and type your question. We've allocated sufficient time at the end of this webinar to address your questions. And now I would like to introduce you to our moderator, Dr. Eric Hittinger, visiting professor at the University of Lille in France and professor of public policy at the Rochester Institute of Technology. Eric, over to you.
Okay, thank you, Dave. I just want to give a brief introduction to the event and let the students themselves start showing off their work, because this is a slightly longer event than the usual 1-hour webinar. So this event is normally delivered at the annual conference, which has been delayed a year because of the coronavirus. And we're doing things online here, but we're trying to do them in the same way that we have at the event in the past. So what happened with this event is students were asked to send in papers that they thought were excellent. We had a panel of judges who selected 4 papers as being the best from the ones that were submitted. And those 4 presenters are all here to spend about 15 minutes each presenting their work. And then we have about 10 minutes for question and answer for each paper. So we have a panel of judges, so I'll thank the judges. So we have Ken Gillingham from Yale, Mark Agerton from UC Davis, and Jim Smith from Southern Methodist University as our judges. So I want to thank them for the time that they have spent reading papers and coming up with questions. And if anyone in the audience has questions, you can send them in through the Q&A function in Zoom. I can't guarantee that we will get to the questions of the audience members, but if we have time, I will try and bring those up to the presenters myself. So each of the 4 presenters will have about 25 minutes, and I'll try and keep an eye on the time. And then afterwards, the judges will confer and select a top paper from among these 4 papers that have already been selected as excellent papers. Unfortunately, there's no award ceremony here, so you will have to check back on our social media pages or on the website that you use to register for this to find out who actually was selected as the top paper. But that's how we'll have to do it for this year. So anyway, pressing on to the 4 papers, we're putting them in no particular order. I selected them using a random number generator. And coming up first is Xingchi Shen from University of Maryland, who is presenting about air source heat pumps, house prices, and its implication for electrification and deep decarbonization.
Hi, hello everyone. Let me share my slides. Okay. Sorry. Okay, so can you see my slides now? Yeah, so the title of my presentation is the estimation of changing house sales price in the US after heat pump adoption. And thanks for the generous funding from Sloan Foundation. So the motivation of this paper is to promote the electrification and the deeper decarbonization. As we all know, stabilizing Earth's temperature will require that we should stop burning fossil fuels or capture the emissions. In the context of space heating, it is more economical and technologically easier for us to capture the emissions from large sources, such as the electric power plants, while it is much harder for us to capture the emissions from small distributed sources, such as the tens of millions of natural gas furnaces across the USA for space heating. So how can we promote the electrification for space heating? Heat pumps provide one pathway. So heat pumps are a new energy efficient technology for space heating. It only uses electricity and it can also save electricity. So there are three major types of heat pumps, which are air source, geothermal, and water source heat pumps. And this paper focuses on the air source heat pumps, which are the most common one. And many national, state level, and city level decarbonization plans have relied on the diffusion of heat pumps, such as the Dutch government, Irish government, Finland governments, and the Massachusetts in the USA. So let's look at the map of the density of the air source heat pumps by county level in the US. We can find that the distribution of the heat pumps are very imbalanced, and the penetration rate of the heat pumps is also very limited. So we should spare more and more efforts to promote the transition to heat pumps. So the logic of this paper is that we wanted to explore the impact of the heat pump adoption on the housing value, and we can estimate the price premium induced by the heat pumps. This price premium can be a very strong incentive for house owners to adopt the heat pumps. So this paper has two contributions to the literature. Firstly, existing studies of the price premium from energy efficiency mostly focus on green certification or energy efficiency ratings, not on specific technologies, such as heat pumps. And secondly, this paper also contributes to the literature on the energy efficiency gap. So there are a lot of discussions on the energy efficiency gap, and I think our paper can provide evidence that the positive price premium, the positive house sales price premium can also be regarded as a significant private benefit in energy efficiency investment, which can help close the energy efficiency gap. The major data set of this paper we used this zero data set. So we have about 4 TB of data for more than 150 million homes in all the states of the US. And we have two parts of the data. The first part of the data is assessment data. This includes including property assessment information such as property characteristics, installed heating and cooling technologies, and other information. Find 6 independent property assessments from 2016 until 2018. And the second part of the data is the transaction data. Our data set includes information for the detailed public transaction records since early 20th centuries. So the first aim of this paper is just estimate the house price premium induced by heat pumps, air source heat pumps. So the empirical strategy of this paper is differences. We need to identify the treatment and control groups. Sorry. The treatment group are the houses that installed a heat pump and was sold at least twice before and after the installation. And the control group are the houses that keeping using one specific heating system and was sold at least twice during a similar time window. So the total time span of this study is from 2000 until 2018. And then we match treated houses and the control houses that are in the same counties. And then we remove the houses that were remodeled after year 2000 to fully remove the influence of the remodeling. So we use these criterions to check every state of the US. And finally, we obtain 14,000 houses in the treatment group and 440,000 houses in the control group across the country, covering 23 states. So we then conduct a balance check to make sure the control group and the treatment group are comparable. So we use 6 covariants of the major building features. And we found that overall, the two groups, the control and the treatment groups, are balanced. And then to justify the parallel trend assumption, we conducted a pre-treatment parallel trend test. We regress the log of pulse price on the interaction terms between an indicator for being in the treatment group and the year of sale, controlling for county by year fixed effects, months of year fixed effects, property fixed effects, and building age, using only pre-treatment data. And we found that all the coefficients of the interaction terms are insignificant, which indicates that there's no significant differential trends between the treatment and the control groups. So further, we can conduct our difference in differences model, which is also the two-way fixed effects model. Our outcome is the log of sales price, and we also control for the building age and the different kinds of fixed effects. And we classed our standard error at the houses level. So this is a table for the results. We tried different kinds of fixed effects, but we show preference to the last model, to the last column 4, which includes the county by year fixed effects. So the coefficient is positive significantly. It's about 7%. In other words, it's about $70,000. So that's our estimated price per meter induced by the air source heat pumps. However, there's an issue because DID approach relies on the intertemporal price variation. So the estimates would be biased if the hedonic gradient shifts over time. So we conducted a robust check using the only cross-sectional data set in conjunction with the nearest neighbor matching. We first conducted exact matching on city and the transaction year. And then we use the propensity score matching to match on the major building features. And then we run OLS model. So all the coefficients are significant positive, which are consistent with our main findings. Moreover, there are another two concerns. So in our DID model, the contemporaneous energy efficiency and the building upgrades may also be captured by the dummy variable of the heat pump adoption in our DID model. And these impacts can cause our price per meter to be overestimated. So we needed to address these two concerns. So, and then that's why we conducted a lower bound analysis. Firstly, we take into account the contemporaneous energy efficiency upgrades. We show that the difference in energy efficiency investments other than the heat pump is minor between houses with and without heat pumps using the residential energy consumption survey dataset from EIA. This figure just plots the marginally increased property of adopting energy efficiency measures for the houses with heat pumps against the houses without heat pumps using property models. You can find that all the coefficients, all the properties are not very large, are very small. And secondly, we take into account the contemporaneous building upgrades. We show that other contemporaneous building upgrades, such as adjusting the number of rooms, improving building quality, improving building condition, induced by the adoption of air source heat pumps, is small in our sample. This figure plots the building feature change induced by the adoption of heat pumps. The coefficients are also very small. I think this is in line with our common sense because the construction work or the installation work for the air source heat pumps is not very hard. It's not very complex. It can be very straightforward for the homeowners to install an air source heat pump. So that's why the other building upgrades induced by the heat pump can be very small. So to fully exclude these concerns, we estimated the monetary value of these impacts. So for the energy efficiency measures, we web ascribe the prices of these energy efficiency measures from the online shopping website, and we use the average price to measure the value of these measures. And for the building features, for the common building features, we just run a hedonic model using control houses from 2016 until 2018. And the estimated coefficients can help us to represent the monetary value of these building features. The reason why we conduct this roll-bound analysis instead of controlling for these building features directly in our DID model is that we can only observe the building features from 6 assessments from 2016 until 2018. And we can observe the transactions from 2000 until 2018. So there's a mismatch between the 2 time periods of the data sets. So we conduct this roll-bound analysis. And then we subtract the value of these contemporaneous upgrades from our estimated price per meal to obtain a roll-bound. So our estimated price per meal ranges from 4% to 7%, or $10,000 to $70,000. Okay, so the next part of this research is to explore the relationship between the price per meal and other important factors. In other words, we conduct a heterogeneity analysis. We take into account several important factors, including residents' environmental awareness level, air source heat pump adoption rate, personal income per capita, heating degree days, and cooling degree days. So we use the percentage of people who believe the global warming is happening at the county level to represent the environmental awareness level, and we obtain this data from the Yale program on climate change. And we apply a flexible semi-parametric approach, a partial linear varying coefficient fixed effects panel data model to help us to estimate the heterogeneous price per meals. By the way, you can find this figure. So all the factors are not correlated with each other strongly, except for the heating and cooling degree days. And then, so this figures plot the relationship between the price per meal and the other factors. The horizontal axis are the important factors, and the vertical axis are the price per meals. So to conclude, we can find that residents who are environmentally conscious, middle class, and live in regions with mild climate are more likely to pay for a larger price per meal. Okay, so finally and the last part of this research is to compare the price per meal with the benefit and the cost of switching from a traditional HVAC system to an air source heat pump. We make this comparison in only 2 regions, the South Atlantic and the Pacific, because only these 2 regions have enough treated houses for us to obtain robust estimation. The price per meal in the South Atlantic is 6%. And it is 5% in Pacific. So, and then we compare the price per meal with the cost and the benefit of switching to heat pumps. So the total net benefit includes 2 parts. One is the lifetime avoided environmental damage, and another is the lifetime fuel cost saving associated with switching from a traditional HVAC system to the heat pump, to the air source heat pumps. And this estimation about the environmental damage and the cost saving is based on simulation with local parameters. It's conducted by our co-author. And then we make this comparison. We found that the additional cost of replacing a traditional HVAC system with an air source heat pump is about $3,000, and it is approaching or almost equal to the total net benefit. So in this meeting, we can say that the energy efficiency investment about heat pumps could be reasonable. And then more importantly, we also compare our price per meal with the cost of installing an air source heat pump. We found that our estimated price per meal is larger than the cost of installation. This could be important and directly linked to our policy implication. Yeah, because our results show that the value of the heat pump is recognized by the housing market and home buyers. It could be very valuable for the homeowners who are deciding whether to install heat pumps, because the price per meal, the price per meal can help cover the risk and the cost of installing such a air source heat pumps, which has a higher upfront cost. so that policymakers can also provide information about the estimated price premium for the homeowners to influence the decision about the heat pump adoption. And finally, it can help promote the transition to electrification, and finally, for the deep decarbonization. Yeah. So that's all. Thanks so much for your listening.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Are you ready for some questions? I guess I'll start by inviting Ken and Jim to ask questions, and I have one or two questions, and I actually also have some questions written down from Mark, a judge who couldn't be here.
Eric, do you want to start with Mark's questions?
Yeah, I guess that's right. I'll go. Let's see. I have them open here. Well, let's start with at least one from here that you know, that I thought was interesting was on the map of the regions, the states that have heat pumps. I don't know if you can go back to that slide, but there were a lot of states that had, you know, there's different adoption across states, presumably that's driven by policy. And one of his questions was, you know, couldn't you use some sort of cross-state borders where the climate would be the same, presumably? A lot of the cultural things would be similar across the state borders to sort of study or really verify the results that you're seeing, you know, as a source of exogenous variation, basically crossing state lines from a place that has a lot of heat pumps to a place that has very little.
Yeah. Thanks so much for your suggestion. Yeah, I think this could be a very useful recommendation. Maybe we can do furthermore case study to some regions, like we can do some regression discontinuity, or focus on some specific regions within the borderline, within the small regions across the borderlines. Yeah, we can do some further robustness check, or maybe another new paper. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I guess another one of his questions, which I'll actually combine with one of mine, is so with the thing that you're capturing the value, or at least, you know, you're attempting to capture the value of a heat pump, whether the heat pump is basically present in a home sale or absent in the sale of a home, and what effect that has on the value of the sales price, right? And you know, one of the thoughts that I had is that, I'm wondering if potentially you're capturing two effects at the same time. That is the effect of having a heat pump versus another type of technology, but also potentially capturing the effect of having a newer furnace system, a newer heating system. Like certainly a house that has just replaced its heating system, you know, you usually report that on the Zillow listing. You say, hey, we just upgraded the heating system, and that has a, you know, pretty clear value to consumers. Now, I know in your model, I believe you're just checking whether or not it has the heat pump, you know, before and after. So you just know it has a heat pump now, not necessarily that the heat pump is brand new. However, in my mind, if a house said that it had a heat pump, I would assume that that heat pump was newer than a house that had other types of heating. You know, a house that had any old type of heating system, that heating system could be brand new, or it could be 5 years old, or it could be 25 years old. Yeah. But if a house has a heat pump, I would expect, you know, I don't know what my prior is, but I would guess the average house with the heat pump is only a few years old, 5 years old or something like that. So I wonder if you're capturing two effects at the same time, the effect of having a heat pump, and since heat pumps are generally a newer technology in houses, the effect of having newer technology, you know, a newer system that presumably is further from end of life. And I may be misunderstanding, so I'll let you respond.
Yeah, okay. Thanks so much for the question. Yeah, it's very important. So basically, we identified the heat pump adoption from 6 assessment from 2016 until 2018. So yes, our the heat pumps in our study are all new heat pumps. So actually, we are estimating the value of the new heat pumps. And we also we conducted the difference in differences. So I think that we have a control groups, and the control groups the purpose including the control groups are we want to measure the housing change trends other than the heat pumps valuation. So what I would say is I just want to say that maybe I just want to say we just estimated the value of the newly installed heat pumps. Yeah.
Okay, so I guess in a sense you might be capturing both of those effects together. Maybe I'm not sure, which is okay.
It's together because these heat pumps are all new. Yeah.
Sure. Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah. Because then I guess I'm curious, like, how much of the effect is from saying, hey, I have a new heating system? How much is the effect from, hey, I have a new heating system that is a heat pump?
Yeah, but here I think we combine the two effects because these heat pumps are all new.
Sure. Okay, well, I should let Jim and Ken ask questions as well.
I can follow up because that's really related to my line of questioning. Is that okay, Eric?
Please.
Yeah, great. Yeah, no, thanks for the nice presentation. I was thinking similarly to what Eric was thinking, but I want to ask a little bit more. And I have 2 questions on that line. So one is, your results are showing this price premium is greater than the typical cost of the upgrading that you're talking about. I wanted to ask, first of all, does that typical cost, that's the additional cost, right? So this is a somewhat surprising result. It's kind of akin to overshifting in some sense, which can happen, but it's somewhat a surprising result. So my question is, why? Why do you think that you're finding it? This is exactly the slide I was thinking of. Perfect. Why do you think that this is the case? And then my second question on this result is, what are people upgrading from? And did people, when they upgraded, have to, say, take out a natural gas line, take out an oil tank? I know most of your data are from California in the South, so it'd be more natural gas line. Sometimes there are associated costs when you switch to electric power, like an air source heat pump, that are not the heat pump itself, but are actually added costs that are required when you have someone come out and deal with the old system that you had. I think they're a little higher when it's coming from oil, but they could also be there for natural gas as well. Have you considered those? Those are my questions. Thanks.
Thanks so much for your questions. So for your first question, yeah, way to explain our findings. So basically, the larger price per meter compared to the cost of installation, we think. Firstly, I want to mention that the lower bound of the price per meter is very approaching to the cost of installation and a little higher than the cost of installation. And then we want to explain that the higher price per meter could be explained by several costs, such as the transaction costs, opportunity costs, and their precipitative costs. So this could be leading to the price per meter higher because you buy a house with the heat pumps and you do not need to do anything to have the heat pumps, especially for this new kind of technology. And secondly, I want to further explain how we estimate the environmental damage and fuel cost savings. So basically, we divided all the states into 2 categories. One category is the states with the main fuel sources for space heating, which is natural gas, and the other states whose major fuel sources for space heating is electricity. And then we use the different scenarios to compute the benefits and the cost of transition. But this is only based on the simulation. So maybe in the real life, because of the consumer heterogeneity, different homeowners and they may have a different cost of this switching. So maybe we need further data to compute the cost and the benefits. Yeah. I don't know whether I answer your second question correctly. Yeah. And I also maybe you can also read our discussion part of this paper. We explain all of this. We explain this figure. Yeah.
Thank you. We should give Jim a chance to ask questions.
I want to give. We're getting close to time, but I'm sure. But I want to let Jim ask a question as well.
Well, just very quickly, can you hear me? Am I on?
Yeah, I can.
Okay. On that same slide on 2024 there, I had two questions. One, the top line, total net benefit. I guess that's computed relative to the upper bound price premium. Is that correct?
The total net benefit is the sum of the life avoided environmental damage plus the lifetime fuel cost saving.
Okay, I see. And my second question is that you framed this research really as trying to point to a pathway for cost-effective mitigation through deep decarbonization. And when I look at the avoided environmental damage here in both of these regions, it seems like it's pretty much negligible, which would indicate you don't really need a policy. This isn't part of a government policy. All of these benefits would flow more or less even if there were no policy, simply based upon the private benefits that flow from the investment. Is that your interpretation?
You mean how to explain the very minor environmental benefits?
Not how to explain them, but what are the implications that they're so minor?
Yeah. So I think because our research is toward the future. So far, currently with the current power grant, I think because our electricity also burning some fossil fuels, so that's why there are little environmental benefits. But in the future, we need with more renewable energy integrated in our power grant, we should use more electricity. So our paper is not only focused on the current grant, but also for the future. Yeah.
Okay, well that's all I have. Thanks very much. It was an interesting presentation.
Thanks so much for your questions.
Great, thank you. Well, we're actually out of time, so thank you for your presentation and answering the questions. And our next speaker is Alexandra Lute from Copenhagen Business School. She will speak to us about the distributional effects in local electricity market designs, evidence from a German case study.
Great. Can you all hear me and see my slides?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you very much for having me here today. Quickly need to move something here. Yeah, Alexandra, I'm a PhD at the Copenhagen Business School, and today I will present a piece of work that I have done with my co-authors from TU Berlin, Jens Weibetzahn, and from Technical University of Denmark, Jan Martin Zepter. And we are looking at distributional effects in local electricity market designs, and we use a German case study as for this. And yeah, basically we look at the end of the traditional value chain, the end users in the energy system and their possibilities to contribute. Today's presentation will be along the following structure. I will explain the concept behind the study, describe the path of analysis, then present some results and derive some conclusions. And I will end my presentation with a collection of further research options. But first to the concept. We follow the prosumer in the energy system. An energy prosumer is typically someone that, on the one hand, consumes electricity, just as we are right now, but then on the other hand, also produces electricity. This can be from PV on the roof or throughout wind energy or other technologies. Prosumers can also own a storage entity. Some might refer to this as a prosumer then instead of a prosumer. Generally, prosumers self-consume the generated electricity, feed into the public grid what they don't use, and they can be remunerated with feed-in tariffs. In the presence of a storage entity, they usually first store their self-produced electricity before they sell. Then in Germany, prosumers are not entirely new to the system. The first installation of renewable energy was starting to be used in the grid in 1991. And then in 2000, the Renewables Energy Act came into force and introduced the first fixed-in tariffs. And then until 2015, there was a constant increase of prosumers, reaching an accumulated number of about 1 million in 2015. Then in 2016, the EU introduced a new directive for the energy union that puts the consumer at the center of the system. A follow-up directive in 2019 actually calls for the consumer empowerment, which then also should include dynamic prices and citizen energy communities. The direction towards a full consumer-centric energy system is now being discussed around Europe, and new market designs are developed, evaluated, in order to find new perspectives. In the German context, feed-in tariffs fade out after 20 years of payment, and then there is no other option in place to further sell electricity from, for example, a rooftop PV installation after those 20 years. Furthermore, at the time of developing this study, there was a cap on installed PV capacity in Germany, which would have stopped any payment of fixed feed-in tariffs. This has been abolished in June this year, with the consequence that the further research options slightly change. However, the insights we gained from the study are still relevant for further elaborating the ways of including prosumers. And this is basically where we start our journey through the research. So we start with the concept of local electricity markets. While in the past, people have started putting rooftop PV batteries or wind to their houses, property, and received remuneration from subsidized mechanisms. Active prosumer communities might actually need a different mechanism in the future. So one of the suggested mechanisms is peer-to-peer trade in local electricity markets. This concept allows prosumers to self-consume their electricity and then directly trade it with their neighbors using the local grid, and then they receive money from this local trade. Trade here refers to financial trade and not physical trade of electricity. So the concept that has been developed, this concept has been developed and then analyzed, discussed, and so forth a lot in research in the recent years, and studies find it actually highly attractive and competitive. It was also shown that local markets actually reveal local preferences and increase the value of local generation, which is very important when it comes to public acceptance. Nevertheless, we also see some downsides. Michael Pollitt shows in a study that cost distortion and distributional effects might arise in the presence of these local markets. And in addition, there are a high number of prerequisites. One of them excludes a large part of the society, which is the ownership of property and affluency to afford generation technology, and that is not given to a major part of the population. So for this described concept of peer-to-peer trade, we learn various conclusions from the literature, but so far only pilot projects have tested the concepts in real life. To move one step further and see how the local markets aligns or may not align with the German regulation, we ask The research question, what are the implications and effects of local electricity market designs for energy communities under Germany's current tariff mechanism? Concluding from the answer to this question, we would learn whether or not we should adjust the current framework. Another approach we follow up is to make changes to the local market designs that have so far been suggested. And this actually brings us to our second research question. That is, how can we adjust the existing concepts of local electricity markets in order to ensure a fair distribution of costs between all participants? To perform an analysis, we set up 3 different cases which differ in the rules, so the market design that we apply for our local community for energy purchase. We start by setting up the case that is highly discussed in the literature. So that is the local market with a peer-to-peer trade. The market allows prosumers to self-consume and trade their electricity using the grid, and then they receive some payment for what they sell to their neighbors. Following the literature, taxes and grid tariffs are not, or at least at a lower rate, paid on these local traded electricity. Then, following up on our first research question, we align this theoretical setup with a regulatory framework. Along with an increase on administrative tasks for each prosumer, we also find that grid tariffs need to be paid as for all other electricity purchases that come through the grid to a household. And then when we look at our second research question, which we would which we run in parallel, literature clearly states that 2 points make this scheme of local electricity markets unattractive. One is the ownership, and the other one is the cost distortion for grid costs. And this takes us to a new adjustment that we see and a new possibility. And we introduce an independent power producer, which is someone that owns a bigger installation and sells share of this installation to all kinds of electricity customers. To make it a bit more visible, maybe take, for example, a family in an urban area that lives in a rental apartment, and they buy a share of PV installation that is placed on a local supermarket's roof. So that is the idea behind this. And this is the case setup. And now we move on to the analysis. To analyze this, we set up a model to get a better understanding of the situation, and then to be able to answer the questions and understand the mechanisms behind this trade. We use the methodology of an equilibrium model and set up a cost minimization problem for each individual player. For the analysis, we have prosumers and consumers. And then we translate the graph that you see on top of the slide into a cost minimization problem for each of the participants. For the consumers, the cost of electricity at each point of time presented the sum of the costs paid for grid electricity and for local electricity. For the prosumers, we have more supply options. They can consume renewable electricity from their own production. And in addition, they can sell to the community, leading to the equation on the bottom. Then when we have prosumers, they can also store their generation and use the electricity from the battery, and which leads to this equation. And when we then open up for the IPP to join, the graph becomes more advanced, but the equation now holds for all participants with regard to their supply option. As data, we use a rather small data set of 14 households in a German village with 12 prosumers, 2 consumers, and historic data on production and consumption from 2018. The choice of this small data set lets us understand the mechanisms in the community and the electricity trade to a very detailed level, but there are also further research options here. Looking at the results. So what we observe in general is that prosumers profit most from owning both generation technologies and storage, and a pure consumer sees only a small decrease in costs. We then also observe that cheap rates in the local market can only be reached by avoiding grid fees, as suggested in the literature. And yeah, that is the main assumption behind this local trade. Then we also observe that most participants can lower their costs compared to today's framework. What does this have to do with the figure on the left? So we compare costs for different types of participants in the figure, prosumers, prosumer, and consumer, for 4 different cases. The column to the left represents the case of today, where people are either consuming electricity from the grid, or they are producing it for themselves, using it for themselves, and then feeding the rest into the grid. The second column represents the local market, then followed by the regulatory framework, and the fourth one is the new scheme, including an independent power producer. Comparing these 4 columns, it becomes visible that grid tariffs increase costs for electricity, which is comparing the second to the third one. But those costs cannot be avoided because the grid somewhat needs to be financed. Consumers to the right can only benefit if they have their own shares of generation. Looking at the 4th column, they actually see a decrease in costs for electricity. And looking at today in the new case, we definitely decrease costs for each of these participants, which is comparing column 3 and 4. And now let us look at another, maybe not too intuitive graph, but we show grid usage against taxes and duties paid. To put this a bit simpler, we show how much money the grid operator earns per kilowatt hour. The aim is to show that costs for the grid are fixed, and the lower the use, the higher the charge per kilowatt hour. Then looking at today, case number 1 to the right, everything runs through the grid. So there's no storage and a lot of feed in from rooftop PV, for example, which other consumers pay grid charges on once they consume it. Then zooming in on the left on case 4 and 5, which is local market regulation, then introducing the regulatory framework, and the case of an independent power producer, we see that for the theoretic case of a local market, we have comparatively high grid use, but very low fees. These fees would increase and need to be split among all that use the grid. Following this, for case 6, the IPP, the situation would improve significantly, almost the same quantity. We are referring to this light green bubble, the second one from the bottom. The situation would improve, and then almost the same quantity would be paid, but then would be going through the grid, but then even higher grid tariffs would be paid. So in case 4 and 5, specifically consumers who mainly rely on the grid because they don't own PV or any other technology, would see an increase in their grid fees, which would be purely allowing for local trade for prosumers to benefit from this local trade. Recalling these 2 graphs, we summarize our findings as answers along with the 2 research questions. For the first question, adjusting the regulatory framework, we face the risk of distributional effects and a higher number of changes. Improvements to the market design, we see a chance to lower the risk of distributional effects by allowing more end users to participate. And we see that the case of independent power producers can be easier to implement. We also derive some policy implications from this. For the pathway of an adjustment of the framework, there's a need to align incentives for all market participants, but this is then specifically the case if decentral energy transformation is desired. For the market designs, there is room for adjustment and improvements in many directions. For our suggested model, the goal would be to form one standardized solution that supports the creation of business models for energy communities. For an IPP in Germany, this would imply a redefinition of a few legal terms and some changes in rules for purchases of shares of installation. To round this up, we see many options to extend the research. First, analysis can be conducted with a larger data set to verify the results. the assumption of curtailing excess production needs to be reassessed, as this generated electricity might actually benefit the system. And uncertainty in production and market prices can have an influence here. Second, policy implications need to be further elaborated. An assessment of distributed energy transformation with local energy sharing can be helpful to understand its value. We need to better understand the participation and energy use in urban areas, and the effects of local markets on the energy system needs to be further studied to assess the impact of the introduction. This was my presentations. Here I end. Thanks for your attention, and I'm happy to answer questions.
Okay, great, thank you. This time, why don't I start with Jim and Ken, and then I will use Mark's questions and mine as backup for if we have time.
Sure, I can start. Is that good, Eric?
Please.
Yeah, so two questions. One is, I may have missed this, but did you include any warm glow from the prosumer generating their electricity from green electricity? That's one question. And if so, why not? It didn't look like it was included, but there were some differences in the minimization problem, because it was taking a non-utility framework, although I guess implicitly that was the utility function. It's a very engineering style framework here. And then a second question is, what about the social perspective? So we have the prosumers problem, we have the individual consumers problem, we have the independent producers problem, we have equilibrium going on here. What about the social perspective?
Okay, I'm not sure I understand. I understood the very beginning of your first question. You're asking about what part of the
I was asking about warm glow, Andreoni, for example. If you're not familiar, then don't worry about it. Many people believe that consumers who decide, some people who adopt solar will adopt solar because even if it's not a great investment, because they really like it. It makes them happy. Yeah. You know, it provides a warm glow in Andreoni terms, in classic Andreoni terms, right? So I was wondering how that fits into your framework, that warm glow fits into your framework.
Okay, so for this, well, I'm not sure I fully understand what you're targeting at, but we use those PV panels generally have been put in place, and the aim is not fully to make it cost attractive for the prosumers to install these installations in a way that they have to make money, but it is rather something that we were looking at the distribution of costs that occur once people put these on the top of their house.
Yeah, that's right. And I was asking whether there was where warm glow would fit in here. If people are getting some added utility from the generation that's from the prosumer generation, that was my question. Okay. And it's okay, they don't in your model, but I was asking, is this something you thought about?
Okay, and then for the other one, we are looking at costs, and you were asking about the social perspective.
How would you set up the problem differently if it was a social planner's problem, and or does your model, do you see it matching a social planner's problem?
Well, I guess it depends on the way we look at the analysis at the end. Kind of looks at the perspective how we improve situations for one part of the society, and for the other group of participants that we analyze here. And looking at this, I guess it depends on how we structure the analysis. looking at the outcome of what we see.
Kind of a very constrained social planner is
Yeah.
brought in at the end. I see. Thank you.
I just had one question. Thanks for, again, a very interesting presentation, Alexandra. And it's regarding the Tech for All scenario, which I think you rationalize or justify as protection from consumers that would otherwise share a disproportionate burden of grid costs, since they're not off the grid. And we still have the full grid cost, but we've got a smaller set of people that are exposed to it. And so my question is, given the option to, as you say, buy a piece of independent power producer on top of the grocery store, my sense is that some households would be more likely to be motivated to do that, either because they pay more attention, or because they're better educated, or because they have more liquidity, or because they're less risk averse, or who knows why. But my feeling is there would be a residual class of households that don't take that offer. And then we have an even more magnified problem of loading the grid costs on that smaller group. Do you know anything about the kind of transactional evidence that households would take up or maybe not take up along demographic lines or whatever? What do we know about that?
So your question targets at whether we know what the structure of people who would decide on buying these shares is.
Yeah, is there any kind of analogy that we've already witnessed that would give us a clue as to whether it's kind of the size of this problem and who would be the residual victims, if you want to think of it that way, if there are to be any victims?
Yeah, so the idea behind this is actually not to target all groups, because there will not be a residual group that has to pay the remaining grid costs, as we introduce in this Tech for All market design. We introduce the rule that everything that is purchased from an IPPP still has to be taxed and still has to pay all grid fees. So whenever you purchase this share of a PV installation, you wouldn't put other people who do not buy these shares at worse off, because you would still contribute to everything that needs to be paid for the grid. And then, well, of course, in general, we would need to try to address more people by making standardized offers and giving them a larger chance to actually target this, because it might be more attractive, because prices for electricity don't change no matter whether you have a share or you just buy it from the grid. So that was the idea behind this, so that that there is a chance for participation, which is a more social aspect of this, but it is not mandatory to cover all the grid costs, because the system as it is right now would also cover these.
Just to follow up, that is the answer, right? And it gave me some insight that I didn't have from the presentation. But so what happens if there's really no gain from buying into the IPP? Why do it? And if nobody does it, does this model still work?
Well, it can be, so the electricity can be slightly cheaper, but if you get it from there, and the chance of selling something to someone else is given then. So you might have the incentive to lower your cost for electricity, but you don't put someone worse off by not buying this in terms of grid costs. So you split all the costs that are there for the existing system, just as we do it right now. So we still change it, but then there are different mechanisms in place that might have a benefit for the one that decides on buying this share. So if people don't want to buy this share of a PV installation, then they might not have, they have higher electricity costs, but definitely not because they consume from the grid, which which yeah, is still financed on the way we finance right now. If
Okay,
that makes
thank
somewhat
you.
sense.
I think there's time for one more question. So I'll sort of once again combine some thoughts of mine with a question that Mark wrote down for us, and that is, have you thought about kind of the strategic response in the long term that consumers might have under these different policy setups, I guess, market designs, that, you know, of course, if putting solar on my roof is more favorable in one scenario than another, perhaps, you know, I want to go and add solar to my roof and become a customer with solar, and transition from a customer that's merely a consumer to one with solar. But then there's even more sophisticated things that one could do. Mark actually pointed out that you know, there's a lot of opportunities if there was buying and selling of power for a demand response to become a thing. You know, if you have a smart thermostat, you could pre-cool your house with either, you know, at noon when it's sunny from either your solar or your neighbor's solar. And I wonder if you've thought about how these sort of strategic dynamics might affect some of the results that you found.
That is something that we are actually starting to look into. So we are starting to look into, on the one side, the effects that this has on the system. So there might be an effect that all these either local trades or buying these shares and decentralizing and distributing all of this have on the system, so on the operation of the centralized system that we have in place at the moment. And then on the other hand, looking at demand response and those business models that incorporate a lot of digitalization, and then make your household or your smart home more flexible with either the battery or some heating device that is flexible. That is something that we are looking at right now, and we're trying to see whether these business models actually have a capacity that can contribute to the system in whatever stage, either in already in redispatch or maybe somewhat closer to real-time operation, or, and then on the second part, we are looking at the system implications that these mechanisms actually have on the system as it is right now. So I don't have insights on this at the moment, but definitely something that we are looking into at the moment and trying to develop, implementing it either in the model or, and then we are running a more quantitative analysis on the business models and their.
Okay. Great. Okay, great. Thank you. So we're out of time. So thank you for your presentation and answering our questions. And I'd like to move on to our next speaker, and that's Megan Lang from the University of California, Berkeley, who will be telling us about contracting for electricity in low-income countries, the role of liquidity constraints, and transaction costs.
Great. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Great. So yeah, this is my paper that thinks about contracting for electricity in the presence of poor storage, transaction costs, and liquidity constraints. So to motivate this work, I just like to highlight the role that prepaid electricity is currently playing in contracting for electricity all over the world, but particularly when contracting with low-income households. And there are a couple of reasons for that. On the side of the household, prepaid electricity can offer some flexibility in payment, which can be really useful. On the side of the firm, it also tends to lower enforcement costs, which can be a nice aspect of it. However, in practice, prepaid electricity, particularly in rural low-income settings, often doesn't store well and can involve transaction costs. So I'm going to be looking at pay-as-you-go solar, which in a couple of slides I'll explain is a good that in some sense is strictly non-storable. Even when you think about more traditional settings though, where people are prepaying for on-grid electricity, if they have difficulty tracking how much they're using or if they're inattentive, they may face kind of this effective storage problem where they're running through their prepaid electricity faster than they mean to. Transaction costs are also important for rural consumers because rural consumers often need to travel to buy or prepay for electricity. And at least in my setting, those are going to end up being important costs that consumers bear. So if a consumer is trying to cope with this combined problem of poor storage with transaction costs, there are basically two ways they can go about doing that. The first is that they can buy in bulk, which is obviously going to reduce the total amount of transaction costs that they pay, but it potentially creates waste. So again, think about kind of running through electricity faster than you mean to. The alternative is to buy small amounts frequently. That, of course, is going to incur pretty high transaction costs overall, but it does eliminate waste. Now, one of the important points that I raise in my paper is that for liquidity-constrained consumers, buying small amounts frequently might be the only option that they have. And so they're effectively going to be facing higher prices for electricity. That has a couple of welfare implications. So the first is that consumers might just be getting limited welfare from electrification when they're kind of optimizing in this world that's filled with constraints. But methodologically, it also means that willingness to pay is going to provide an inaccurate measure of welfare because demand is being distorted by market frictions. So I answer two research questions in this paper. The first is, to what extent are transaction costs and liquidity constraints distorting demand for solar? And I work in rural Rwanda as my setting. And then I want to think about what my empirical results imply about consumer surplus from electrification. So a little bit of background on pay-as-you-go solar, since it's not the most common contract structure. What's happening with these contracts is that a household decides that they want to have a solar home system, which is solar panels, a battery for storing some power, and then a number of high efficiency appliances like light bulbs, phone chargers, radios installed in their home. So they're going to make a relatively small down payment, and then the solar company is going to come and install the solar home system. From that point forward, the household is paying as they go for system access time. So system access time is just time when you can use your solar home system as much as you want, up to the capacity of the system, which is not frequently going to be binding in this setting. And the thing that's important to note about system access time is that it's non-storable. So it runs down continuously regardless of how much you actually use it. That means that if I were to buy 3 days of system access time today, then I would have access to my system for the next 3 days. I couldn't, however, choose to save one of those days for later. So if it turns out that I'm not going to be home tomorrow, I couldn't say save that day and use it at a later time. In my setting, I also document that there are substantial transaction costs for buying system access time in the form of travel to mobile money agents, which is what consumers need to do when they buy this access time. And so on average, consumers are spending about 50 minutes getting to the mobile money agent one way. All right, so I answer my research questions using a randomized control trial where I randomly offer a solar specific line of credit, so credit that you can only use for this system access time, to 2,000 current solar customers in rural Rwanda. So as you would expect, the line of credit is reducing liquidity constraints. In practice, it turns out that it's also going to reduce transaction costs. And the reason for that is just that consumers call the solar company and request to use it rather than needing to travel to a mobile money agent to pay for it. I'm going to, within these 2,000 customers, randomly vary the fee charged between 2% and 10%. And that variation is what I'll eventually be able to use to trace out a demand curve and do some welfare calculations. I also randomly vary the size of the line of credit between a 7-day and a 14-day maximum. Today, I'm actually going to show you results pooled between those two groups, but I want to highlight that because I really want to show that we're targeting short-term liquidity constraints. So for rural consumers, we often think about seasonal fluctuations in income. That's not what we're doing here. Finally, I'm going to stratify the sample based on the 90-day pre-experimental utilization rate. The utilization rate is just the proportion of time that a consumer has had access to their solar home system. And so you see in this figure the distribution in the 3 months before I started running the experiment. On the right-hand side, you can see a lot of consumers have access to their systems pretty much all the time. And then there's a long left-hand tail to the distribution of consumers who have access only a fraction of the time. The black lines show where I'm binning consumers for the purpose of stratification, and that's going to give me the statistical power that I need to estimate treatment effects across the entire distribution of consumers. The reason I want to do that is because I document that the pre-experimental utilization rate is a rough proxy for the severity of liquidity constraints that consumers are facing. So as I go through my results, keep in mind that consumers who are on the left-hand tail of this distribution are the most severely liquidity constrained. They're the most likely to report that they don't have access to credit. And then consumers on the right-hand side are the least liquidity constrained. All right, so I generate predictions about my experimental outcomes by extending Deaton's precautionary savings model to include a second good, which is non-storable and involves transaction costs. So that's going to be solar access. Like his classic model, consumers face uncertainty in income, and they're trying to smooth consumption over that. I'm also going to build in uncertainty and the utility gained from solar access. So intuitively, this is just not knowing how many of your family members might be home on a certain night, not knowing whether or not your kids have homework that they need to do, things like that. So my model predicts that offering the line of credit is going to increase demand among liquidity constrained consumers who are not buying in bulk. And importantly, that's going to be true even for consumers who don't actually borrow or use the line of credit. And the reason is just that offering guaranteed access to credit is one way to reduce the precautionary savings motive. It also finds that the line of credit might actually reduce demand for consumers buying in bulk. And the reason for that is that consumers buying in bulk already have access to quite a bit of liquidity. So the line of credit is primarily operating as a reduction in transaction costs. When you reduce transaction costs, you reduce the incentive to buy in bulk, and so you give consumers the opportunity to better target their consumption. And finally, treatment effects should be decreasing in the variance of utility from electricity. And the intuition there relates to the second point, which is just that consumers with the most variation in the amount of utility that they get from electricity are going to be the ones who benefit the most from this opportunity to better target their consumption. All right, so what do I find from the experiment? This figure is showing you heterogeneous treatment effects based on those stratification bins that I showed you a couple slides ago. So on the left-hand side here, we see that consumers with the lowest pre-experimental demand, so these are the consumers who were the most liquidity constrained, are increasing their consumption of solar access time by 11 percentage points, which is a pretty large 88% increase. On the other hand, consumers on the right-hand side of the figure who had the highest pre-experimental demand are actually significantly reducing their purchases of solar access time. So that aligns with my first two predictions from the theoretical framework. Something that you can't see in this figure is that only about 5% of consumers in the lowest pre-experimental demand group use the line of credit compared to 20 to 30% in other groups. So if you think that this entire treatment effect is being driven by consumers who borrow, it implies a local average treatment effect of well over 200 percentage points, which of course is impossibly large. So it means that some of the consumers in this low pre-experimental demand group are actually changing their behavior just in response to being offered the line of credit even when they don't use it. And that's a result that's really difficult to generate with alternative theoretical mechanisms. Briefly here, I proxy for the utility that consumers gain from solar access by looking at the pre-experimental watt hours consumed on days when people have purchased access to solar. And so here, the way you should think about this figure is that on the left-hand side are the consumers who pretty much use about the same amount of electricity on any given day when they have purchased access. And then as we move to the left, there's more and more variance in the amount of electricity used. And again, as the model predicts, we see the treatment effects are highest for the consumers who have the least uncertainty and the benefit that they get from having access. And then the consumers who now can target better are reducing consumption. All right, so that's my first set of results. And now I'd like to move on to the second research question and provide a new estimate of consumer surplus from electricity. So what I'm doing here is using exogenous variation in the fee charged on the line of credit to trace out the demand curve for electricity. I end up finding the demand is highly price inelastic, and I use my estimated demand curve to compute a lower bound on consumer surplus from electrification under my experimental conditions that reduce some of these critical market distortions. This figure just kind of briefly shows the sense in which my estimate is a lower bound. So I'm not going to be estimating the entire Marshallian triangle. I'm only going to be looking kind of at the base of the triangle where I have empirical support for the price variation in my data. So the first welfare result is that marginal consumers in my sample still have a willingness to pay that falls well below cost covering levels. So here I'm showing you my lower bound on consumer surplus per household per year for each of the stratification bins. And the cost covering or break even level is around $77. So what you can see here is that when you take into account the fact that I'm only computing a lower bound, the top 3 stratification bins have a willingness to pay that roughly meets or substantially exceeds the cost covering levels. However, these consumers in the lowest stratification bin, even after the large increase in demand induced by the experiment, still don't have a willingness to pay that comes even close to cost covering levels. And even if I were to extrapolate my demand curve well beyond the empirical price support in my data, it really takes a long time for these consumers to come anywhere close to cost covering levels. So when you think about these consumers and also consumers who aren't even in my sample because they have not selected into these pay-as-you-go solar contracts, it does seem like governments are going to need to provide some significant fiscal support to these marginal households if they want them to become electrified. On a more optimistic note, I do find that estimating consumer surplus under the less distorted market conditions suggests that electrification is more welfare enhancing than some other recent estimates in the literature would suggest. So this table outlines kind of some of the differences between my estimates and others, but I'd just like to highlight that my paper is probably most similar to this estimate by Grimm et al. This year. And my lower bound is coming in at around 44% higher than their overall estimate of consumer surplus. So it does seem that there are substantial increases in welfare when we can reduce these critical market distortions. All right, so to wrap up, I find that liquidity constraints and transaction costs are significantly distorting demand for pay-as-you-go solar, and that they're doing so in a manner that's consistent with my extended model of precautionary savings. What I haven't showed you, but something that I highlight in the paper, is that lowering these market frictions is not actually profitable for the firm. The reason why is that the firm's most profitable customers are the ones with the high pre-experimental demand. And if you recall, those are the customers who are actually reducing demand in response to being offered the line of credit. So that points to a role for regulation, particularly if we think that these prepaid service providers might hold some degree of market power. Finally, I do find that welfare from rural electrification may be higher than previously believed. There's an important caveat here, which is that that's only going to be true if contracts can address relevant market frictions. And it also seems that even if we do address those relevant market frictions, current cost covering prices are still going to be too high for marginal households. So the second policy implication here is that we do need governments to probably provide some support if they want to move towards universal electrification. All right, that's everything I have for today, so I'm happy to take questions now.
Okay, great. Thank you for the presentation. Let me let Jim and Ken start off the questions, and I will follow up with my questions.
I'm happy to lead off. I have one question, and again, Megan, thanks for a very interesting and excellent presentation. One question and one comment. The question is, I want to understand better your statement that the solar power cannot be stored. I understand your explanation about there being system access service time of let's say 3 days, and 3 days is up. But during that 3 days, if you're not using electricity, presumably you're charging your battery. And that's in the system the next 3 days if you sign up again. So it seems to me you could actually be storing from one service period to the next service period. I don't know that that's a major factor in Deaton's model. I mean, his has no storage, but you indicated that this probably applies even with storage. So can you comment on that? And then I'll have a comment.
Sure. Yeah. So that is from a technical perspective, that is true. However, the way that these solar home systems work and the way that the contract is designed is that you actually get locked out of the battery also. So the system access time is quite literally the only time when you get to have access to any of the power generated from your system, including power that might be stored in that battery. And so when you get remotely locked out of your system, when you run out of system access time, that means that you're locked out of your solar panels, but you're also locked out of any power that could be stored in the battery. So that's the sense in which it's a very strict non-storability, despite kind of the technological capabilities of the system.
Well, I think I understand that, but then when you re-up for the next service period, your battery's holding more charge than it would have if you had used more energy during the previous storage period.
Yeah,
so you are moving solar power from one period to the next.
Yeah, so that is true. And that would be, so again, in my scenario, the appliances that these consumers are using are never kind of hitting against the capacity constraint of the system, but you're completely right that if that constraint were binding, then it would be an important consideration.
Okay, and then my comment, to be very brief, is that you've used the word distortion throughout the presentation. The distortions stem from transactions costs and frictions and so forth. I think of those frictions and transactions costs as impacting demand, but they're not distortions of demand. And I understand that you're saying, well, we can knock down some of those frictions, but only through a subsidized program of government regulation, which is a different type of distortion to the market. So I would just, if it were my paper, I would eliminate the word distortion and replace it with impact pretty much throughout.
All right, thank you.
So, thank you.
I'll be quite quick. I actually too was wondering about the word distortions. I know what you're trying to get at, but that struck me as a little odd because these things impact demand, but they're not necessarily like distorting demand. I mean, they can be market failures, but that impact demand. In any event, my question is brief. Yeah, so you mentioned your willingness to pay numbers. They are pretty similar to one other same country study, the Rwanda study that you mentioned. I don't know that study, but I'm more familiar with the Burgess et al. Study, which comes up with much, much lower numbers. Can you provide some insight why your numbers come out so differently than the Burgess et al. Numbers?
Yeah, for sure. So I would say the Burgess et al. Numbers are actually in some sense the worst comparison because I don't have access to the entire demand curve for them. I only have access to kind of like their table of consumer surplus estimates. And their estimates are kind of for all households. Whereas for the other two papers that I compare to, I can actually mimic the type of selection into my sample that's happening because some consumers are selecting into a pay-as-you-go contract and others are not. And so the Burgess et al. Study kind of has all households included, including those households who might not opt into electricity contracts at all. And so there's definitely a selection problem that's going to automatically mean that my estimates are higher than theirs. And that's going to kind of provide an additional difference relative to the other studies where I can actually kind of look and see, okay, well, which consumers actually have a willingness to pay, which is around the market price, and mimic the selection that happens into my sample, if that makes sense.
Great, thank you. One other final piece back on the liquidity constraints and transaction costs. Liquidity constraints sometimes are called market failures, but transaction costs are generally not considered. I mean, they're just true transaction costs. So just, I'm wondering if you have, well, that's a comment. Okay, I'll stop here to make sure others have time.
Sure. Well, actually, Mark wrote down a question that's very related to that statement that you made, Ken. And he noted that, yeah, so the experiment that you set up offers relief of both liquidity constraints and transaction costs at the same time. And Mark was wondering about experiments, alternative experiments that one could do that could focus on one or the other of these, or potentially both separately, to try and look at how they stack up or combine.
Yeah, so unfortunately, there was supposed to be one other experiment that got derailed by COVID. And so there was supposed to be another experiment where basically we try one other mechanism for reducing liquidity constraints without changing transaction costs, which is currently, like, consumers have to purchase a minimum number of days if their system has been switched off in order to switch it back on. So you can't just say, like, buy half a day and have your system switched back on. There's kind of a minimum threshold there. And so we were going to kind of reduce that threshold as a way of limiting the impact of liquidity constraints without actually changing transaction costs at all. Unfortunately, we were not able to do that in an experimental way because the company decided just to reduce those minimum payment sizes for all customers as economies began to be impacted by COVID. So we're kind of working on some event study design, seeing if we can learn anything from it, but everything is a little bit confounded by all of the changes that were happening at the same time.
Sure. Okay. Okay, I can say that's interesting. I can say for my part, you know, I thought that some of the discussion was interesting where you pointed out that, you know, the experiment that you ran does seem to be good for consumers, but it's actually potentially bad for the firm that runs the system. And I guess I was wondering if you've thought about, it's so disappointing when you come across these type of things where incentives are misaligned, but I'm wondering if you've thought about, are there other structures, are there ways of paying or setting up a system like this that might better align those incentives so that, you know, you could capture some of this surplus and distribute it between the consumers and the owner of the system?
Yeah, so I think kind of in general, this entire contract structure is a little bit unnatural in the sense that, you know, kind of the idea behind it has always been that these high demand consumers are in some sense subsidizing the lower demand consumers and allowing the company to kind of serve consumers who are able to pay all the time, as well as some consumers who can't. And so one of the things that you could think about doing is still kind of offering this line of credit, which I show, you know, really increases demand among some of the lowest demand consumers, but pairing it with other types of either price incentives or, you know, other types of perks that the company can provide to these high demand consumers to kind of prop up their demand as well. And so currently, you know, I show that sometimes these consumers are probably buying access time when they aren't getting very big benefits from it. And so if you can, you know, provide perks in the sense of making it easier for those consumers to upgrade their system, or even providing small price discounts as an incentive to kind of pay for more days of solar, then that could be a way to kind of try to get the same benefits that they're getting at the bottom of the demand distribution without having the same negative impacts at the top.
Yeah, interesting. I would say one of the things that Mark wanted to ask was about the liquidity constraint and like how large of a liquidity constraint is this, or specifically his question was, you know, how big of an expense is this for households? Can you give us a sense of scale? You know, and especially on the lower end, the households that aren't using it very much, you know, how is it, you know, I think his hypothesis there, he didn't quite say, is that, you know, maybe they don't want it or need it, you know, it doesn't have a lot of value for them, or maybe it really is the pure liquidity constraint.
Yeah, so I think I don't specifically have income data for the households in this sample, but in general, other studies have found that energy expenditures for solar home systems, or these types of pay-as-you-go systems, end up being around 10% of consumption expenditures for these households. So they are they're significant for sure. And I would also point out that even the households that have low demand are typically, when they don't have enough money to pay for their solar home system, part of what's happening is that they need to take at least some of that money and buy alternative sources like, flashlights or candles or things like that. And so that's part of the way that it's operating, is that it's not like just that you don't have money today, it's that you're going to take some of the money that you do have and buy alternative sources, which is going to make it harder to pay tomorrow as well.
Okay, interesting. Well, we're actually just about at time. I have a few other minor questions, but I should probably hold them. We're just about at time, so let me say thank you for that third presentation, and we will move on to our last speaker, Yuzhen Zhao from Michigan State University, who will talk to us about coping with externally imposed energy constraints, competitiveness and operational impact of China's top 1,000 energy-consuming enterprises program.
Hello, everyone. Can you see my slides?
Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Good morning, everyone. This paper I'm presenting today is coping with externally imposed energy constraint, competitiveness, and operational impact of China's Top 1,000 program. So first, why do we want to study this Top 1,000 program? First, with the global concern of climate change, policymakers around the world are taking actions to improve energy efficiency. These policies could be roughly divided into three groups: the market-based programs like cap and trade or carbon taxes, the negotiated agreements, and the command and control policies. China and the country.
Sorry for interrupting. Can you move yourself a little closer to your microphone? I don't know if I'm the only one, but I'm having a lot of trouble hearing you, and I have my volume at the very highest I can. Thank you so much.
I'm sorry. Would this be better?
Oh, yeah, that's a lot better. Thank you so much.
Okay, so let me continue. So China, as a country that is less market-oriented, still relies on the traditional command and control approach. China has announced the plan for a national carbon market as early as 2011. But currently, we still do not have that. What we have is still a national carbon market in the electricity sector only. On the other hand, we noticed that the literature has predominantly focused on the market-based regulations, and the command and control regulations have received the least attention. As Cohen and Tubb reviewed in their paper, there is only 7 out of 107 studies about Porter hypothesis that focus on command and control regulations. Therefore, there is a growing need to carefully study the command and control-based energy regulations. In detail, this paper seeks to answer the following questions. First, does the Top 1,000 program negatively affect enterprises' profits? If so, how much is the cost? Second, how would the enterprises respond to this policy? The intensity standards have a famous loophole. That is, it may encourage participants to dilute energy use by increasing output. The Top 1,000 program is also an intensity-based standards. Does this have the same problem, or would they bring real technology improvement? We want to answer these questions. So specifically, this paper contributes to the literature in the following ways. First, this paper adds to the literature about the economic impact of environmental regulations. We find that the targeted enterprises face a ROA reduction and their production cost increases. This, based on a rough back-of-the-envelope calculation, equals to about $134 per ton of carbon dioxide. It is much higher than the carbon price in EU's market. The second contribution of this paper is that we studied how the enterprises respond to an incomplete intensity standards. we find that the enterprises expand their production more slowly and increase their fixed assets per capita more quickly. So there is no evidence of dilution, but there might be a problem of carbon leakage because our results basically says that over the years, the top 1,000 firms were becoming less important for China's total energy consumption. They were producing less. The figure shows the timeline of the top 1,000 program. It started in April 2006 and covered around 1,000 enterprises from the 9 energy-intensive industries. The selection threshold is energy consumption of 180,000 TCEs in 2004. All the selected enterprises are given an individual energy saving target. They need to fulfill this target during the period of 2006 to 2010. The enterprises that achieve the target get rewards from the government, and the ones who didn't get penalties. The compliance is directly linked to many incentives, like the award of honorary titles and the evaluation of the SOE's leader, the promotion of local government officials, and whether the enterprises could launch a new project. Later on, the program expanded in 2011, and the name changed to Top 10,000 Program. Top 10,000 Program goes beyond the 9 energy-intensive industry and covers all manufacturing sectors. The threshold is also lowered to 10,000 TCEs in 2010. Given this program design, we use the Top 1,000 Program as our treatment group and select the control group from the Top 10,000 Program. Note that we do so because we do not have any energy data. All the data we have is this official document of the top programs and China's annual industrial survey database. As a result, the top 10,000 program list is the closest information that we have about energy consumption. With the threshold of 10,000 TCEs in 2010, the top 10 participants are more similar to the top 1,000 participants in terms of energy consumption. But even saying so, as we can see in this table, the top 1,000 programs are still very different from the ones that are only covered in the top 10,000 program. They are much bigger and also they are older. There are more SOEs and exporters in the top 1,000 group. To address this issue, we turn to the method of propensity score matching. We use a probit model and then find the identical twins for the top 1,000 enterprises. We managed to find 549 pairs here. It must be noted that we are using the one-to-one nearest neighbor matching, and all the pairs must be from the same industry and same region. Now we can see that the two groups are much more similar to each other. They pass the t-test, the hoteling test. Also, the regression shows us the observed characteristics can no longer explain the participation probability after matching. With a match sample, we implement a difference in difference regression analysis. Here, as you can see, we control for a variety of fixed effects. This allows us to separate the effects of top 1,000 from the firm level fixed effect and also the regional or industrial yearly shock. Of course, the parameter of interest here is this beta 1. It captures how the top 1,000 program has affected YIT, our dependent variable. Before we step to the estimation results, I want to talk a little bit more about the AES target. The AES target could be achieved by both expanding the size of production and increase the overall energy efficiency. The first strategy might cause a production expansion, and the second strategy decrease the production. Also, since the new technology is typically labor saving, we may observe changes in the fixed assets per capita. That is fixed assets divided by labor. Later, we will empirically check which strategy dominant. Now, let's take a quick look at the estimation results from the full sample, the untrimmed sample. The untrimmed sample gives much larger coefficient estimation, and the sizable difference between this table and our main results highlights the importance of doing PSM. Here comes our main results. The first is RA. The estimated coefficient is negative and significant. It indicates that the top 1,000 program negatively affects the profitability of its participants. Then we consider the operating RA. Comparing to the RA, the operating RA will not be affected by no operating incomes, such as the government funding. The magnitude of the coefficient on operating RA is larger than that on RA. It basically implies that due to the no operating income, the top 1,000 enterprises suffers less in terms of our RA. Then we can see the unit cost is increased. This coefficient means that for every 1 RMB of output, the cost for top 1,000 enterprises would be about 0.026 higher. The energy saving mandates clearly erode the profitability of its participants. Finally, we study the operational strategy. We found that the top 1,000 enterprises have lower operating revenue, which could be caused by eliminating production capacity that is not energy efficient. And that is our strategy 1. Strategy 2. We also find an increase in the fixed assets per capita. That is the fixed asset divided by labor. This means that enterprises might choose to replace old equipment with new labor-saving equipment. It is a sign of trying to improve energy efficiency. The remaining question here is the validity of the DD approach. So we use this event study framework to test it. It can be seen that the parallel trend does exist for our PSM trimmed sample before 2006. We also did a variety of robustness checks. We make sure that our estimation is not driven by specific industry, and it is robust to different matching methods. Also, our placebo test says that outside of the non-energy intensive industry, the faked treated enterprises are not affected. So as a takeaway message, the top 1,000 enterprises suffer a lot from being part of the program. Their economic profitability is reduced and they bear a higher cost burden. At the same time, their production expansion is slower and the fixed assets per capita is relatively higher, which could be a sign of efforts to increase energy efficiency. Still, my study suffers from a few limitations. First, we do not have the energy data, thus we cannot do a clean RD-style analysis based on the program's threshold, and we had to do this rather dirty PSM DID. Also, we are unable to develop any analysis on the carbon leakage. We do not know if the enterprises that are covered by top 1,000 program are more energy efficient or less energy efficient compared to their identical twins. So we do not know whether the shrunk production is good or not. But still, this paper finds some empirical evidence with the top 1,000 program. It has higher cost and it seems to work well in terms of energy saving. So that's all. Thanks for your attention.
Okay, great. Thank you. I guess let me start with a clarifying question. of Mark's actually, and then I will let Ken and Jim ask some questions. So the basic equation for the AES, which you've shown a couple times, just for clarification, you mentioned the look of the equation, and in your discussion, you mentioned that you can meet it by increasing output, but is that that also would mean that you know, if there's a downturn, an economic downturn, and output is suppressed, then the policy would potentially become more stringent, right? Is that right? That the policy effectively, if the economy is booming and production is increasing rapidly, that potentially it becomes easier to meet this policy restriction, and if there's an economic downturn, it's actually harder. Is that, which is kind of opposite to many policy designs of this type? Is that right?
Yes, yes, that's what we discussed more in the paper. I didn't say more about it because I think the time limited. But yes, your understanding is correct. Yeah.
Okay, and I guess as a quick follow-up, do you have a sense why they designed it in this way rather than what I might describe as a more conventional way that would become more stringent with growth and less stringent in a contracting economy or slower?
I think when they designed this policy, they want to take the output expansion into consideration. But later on, since we know that there's a financial crisis in 2008, so the target suddenly becomes hard to reach. Based on some case studies that I see, this case study finds that during the financial crisis, these enterprises try to change their way of calculating output to make it easier to reach this target.
Okay.
Like, yeah, they want to because the output could be calculated based on the products units or the money units. They try to find a better. They try to use the larger one to make it easier to fulfill the target.
Okay, great, thank you. I'll let Jim or Ken ask some questions.
Sure, I'm happy to go ahead. Great, thanks for your talk. I'm wondering a little bit about reversion to the mean, in the sense that one of the key findings is that there's this slowdown in production growth, there's this little slowdown in productivity, but the targeted companies are all bigger companies than the control companies. I know they're matching in a lot of other ways, but by definition, they're picked the 1,000 largest companies in those industries, if I understand correctly. So, and bigger companies often tend to grow more slowly than ones kind of on the steeper part of their growth curve. So I was wondering, you do have a placebo test. I was wondering if you can describe whether you believe your placebo test addresses that concern.
Yes. In my placebo test, I did this following process. So first, I focus on the enterprises that are outside of the non-energy intensive industries. Thus, none of them are subject to the energy constraint during my study period. Then I predict the probability of these enterprises being selected into the top 1,000 program. What I use is the previous probability model that I have. Once I have this predicted propensity score, I randomly assign a trait status based on the predicted propensity score. After doing so, I re-perform my PSM DID analysis, and I repeat it for 1,000 times. Then I plot all the t statistics of the beta 1 in this 1,000 in this 1,000 test in this table. As you can see that the t statistics, and all these t statistics are smaller than the 1.96. So I think it basically says that there's no significant impact. I'm not sure if I answered it correctly.
Yeah, I mean, I heard all that. I mean, my question is, are you arguing then that these other enterprises are just like those ones in the top 1,000 in the sense that they're also very large?
Yeah.
That they're equally large. So it's actually what you're matching on is not what my question is about. What my question is about is the top 1,000 are based on this, to the best of my understanding, based on the size of the company. So that is the criteria for being a top 1,000. So matching is a little tricky here because you have to find firms that are equally large, but you can't because the top 1,000 are the top 1,000. So I think that's what my question is. And I think what I was asking in some sense is whether these placebos, these other potential controls are equally large as the top 1,000. And maybe by definition, because they're in other industries, maybe by definition they can't be, but maybe they can be because they're in other industries. Does that question make sense?
Oh, yeah, that's a good question. So do you mean that I need to compare the big companies in other industry with the big companies in this non-energy intensive industry?
That would be very interesting. Top 1,000 outside of in the other industries versus the top 1,000 in those industries, and see if they're about the same size and of similarity. Lots of awfully similar, because very large companies often tend to grow a little more slowly because they're already ramped up.
Yeah. What I like, I understand your point about the top 1,000 are large because, and then they are selected into the program because they are large. So it's tricky to select so-called identical, what I call identical twins for them. Yeah, that's a problem. But what I want to say here in this test is saying that at least for other industries, the rather big one and the smaller one, they do not have a significant difference.
Let others go ahead.
Well, I had basically the same question that Ken has posed, and maybe just to clarify a little bit more, I think the selection criteria here isn't the size of the company, but it's the magnitude of energy consumption in coal equivalents by the company. And I think the fundamental problem or the challenge is that you don't have data on that. So when you go about doing the propensity scoring and even the placebo test of that, you really can't show that those companies that you've matched have equivalent energy consumption. And in fact, as Ken says, we know they don't because this was the top 1,000. And so I just wonder if when you presented the cost that was imposed on those companies subject to the command and control, all those results look very reasonable to me. I don't challenge the conclusions at all because it is command and control, and it should not be as efficient in terms of carbon policy. But given this problem of not having the energy data to do a match, and given the non-random selection, I just wonder how much confidence you have in comparing was it $120 per ton or $130 per ton?
134.
130. Yeah, so how big of a caveat has to be delivered along with that estimate, given, I think, the admitted limitation in the matching? That's my question.
Yes, that's a fair comment. I also think the matching method is not very good. If we have the energy data, we can obviously using RD and do some clean analysis. But here, I want to say that our predicted propensity score is positively related to the energy saving target, and it could also explain like 37% of the variation in the energy saving target. So I kind of think the predicted propensity score is a not so bad substitute when we do not have the real energy consumption. But yeah, the matching method does makes me lack of confidence. Yeah.
Okay, well, but I enjoyed the presentation. Thanks for the response.
And Jim, thanks for that clarification.
Yeah, I guess I could ask another one. And that is, in the paper, it says that you would suggest to separately have an energy consumption cap and energy intensity targets rather than using the AES as this compound tool. And Mark, I'm actually reading Mark's comment here. He says, can you say a bit more about these policies? At what level would they be set, and who would implement them? I'll add my commentary. I think it's potentially an interesting route to go, because going back to my initial question, you could make the policy such that it automatically becomes more strict as growth increases and becomes less binding as growth decreases, potentially through this. But do you have more thoughts about how that might be done and at what level?
In the practice level, I think currently some province in China has already started doing so. They have this separate energy intensity target and also the total energy consumption target. The advantage of that, of course, is that they could control both. But if you can combine the intensity standard and the total consumption, then we may face this problem of production impact, as we have.
Okay. Jim or Ken, do you guys have any last questions that you want to? Okay. Well, we're just about at time. So if not, I will thank our last speaker and thank the audience members that have come along all the way to the end with us. Look forward to more USAEE webinars. I'm sure Dave will advertise for that in a moment. And also look forward to the social media or back on the website you used to get here to find out when the winner is announced, which may be today or probably certainly within the next few days. So over to you, Dave, for the closing comments.
I want to thank all of the contestants. It was really great. You guys did a great job.
Thank you, everybody.
Yeah, thank you, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Eric. Thank you to all of our students and most certainly to our judges for their steadfast support and asking some very tough questions. I have really enjoyed these presentations. Truly, all of you are scholars that we're going to be looking for future research in the years to come, and engage you in our associations as well as our conferences. Well, as Eric did mention, we do have a robust lineup of webinars. You can view those on our website, www.usaee.org. I know that all of our students that have participated here are members of the association. We thank you for your membership and your participation in our organization. Thank you all once again. Wish you a good rest of your day, wherever this finds you. And I officially close this webinar. Bye now.